Good morning, everyone. I've made a lot of progress in my sketchbook. We are actually coming near the end of the Alien St. Patrick's Day Parade, which is the theme of the sketchbook. And last night I finished reading a Smithsonian book of comic book comics, and I wanted to share with you the last few chapters of that as we close out this this little introduction to the history of comic books. Now, I'm not going to say too much about Pogo because I have a lot of Pogo books, and we will be looking at Pogo in depth. Walt Kelly is probably my greatest inspiration. Suffice it to say, this is the comic book version of Pogo, and this version actually existed at the same time as the newspaper version. This is around 1950 or so. I'm just kind of going from memory. Okay, this is 1951. One thing I did notice is I did not see Mademoiselle Hepzibah, who is Pogo's skunk girlfriend, who would have worked very well in this fairy tale. She could have been the Prince Charming to Pogo's Cinderella, or she could have been, the fairy godmother or something like that. That would have been very cute. I think Mademoiselle was underused in the comic strip, but we can talk about that later. All right, let's turn to Eisner's The Spirit, and I'm not an expert on the Spirit in any way, but one thing that I do think that is worthy of notice is that the Spirit was published as, how to say this, kind of like a comic book supplement for the newspaper. So, for a time when someone opened up certain newspapers, this is 1941, there would be basically a mini comic book, a little bit like Parade magazine in some newspapers today, or like an Ashcan comic book, perhaps, not to that size. So, I mean, this was a weekly mini book feature. I do want to point out an interesting element about the art. Well, for one thing, the Spirit stories were geared more towards an adult audience. So, this is noir crime with a little bit of a hint of the supernatural. Well, here, a criminal is injected with the element of time, and the colors change to represent a maybe a possible future or a parallel world where he commits a crime and is punished by the spirit. Now, this is a very good use of the comic book medium because while this could have been achieved in film in 1941, maybe with maybe Hitchcock could have done it, but I think the comic really brings out the otherworldliness of this situation. If this were done today, I'm sure there would be lots of CGI and color grading. In this next adventure, we can see actual photographs of New York City used as backdrops for the comic, at least in a couple of instances. Uh, excuse me. Pardon me. And that does lend this panel work here. That does lend a kind of an otherworldly feel to it. And then the final story, the time is now 10:31, and we find out that these are the last 10 minutes of this young man's life. So there is a ticking clock element to this comic. You'll notice every page begins with the ticking clock. This book concludes with EC Comics, which were originally educational comics, and then they became entertainment comics. But we best know this as what became Mad Magazine. These were originally a lot of different comics. And two figures to Noah William Gaines, later famous Mad Magazine, and Kurtzman, who later went on to Playboy. He did Little Annie Fanny, and here we see Korean War comics. This is an interesting look at the time. I'm sure my grandfather was reading this during the war. I don't really think we have war comics today. We kind of have adventure comics that may mention a war, but we don't really have war comics per se. And here we have Mad Magazine with Super Duper Man. This is unlike the Mad Magazine with which I was familiar with growing up. I mean, this Mad Magazine was originally a comic book, not a magazine. But it does have some of the elements that I later attained. Howdy Doody. Some of this humor I can recognize. Mad Magazine was always in my time it was very counter-cultural. Um, and in here in Howdy Doody, they're making fun of the. Actually, let me show you. It's a little slice of time here. Our constant readers have no doubt noticed our sudden shift to television. So television, this is 1954, was still new, a brand new, possibly intrusive medium, rife for parody already at that point. And then we conclude with this is essentially a Twilight Zone story, The Master Race, and here we have the the inner monologue in sort of a Prince Valiant fashion typed up there. But I want to bring out one. Let's look at the art here, where we see a face repeated. This man is in a train, and he has lots of memories, and so this is not only an impression of the movement of a train, but also the movement of the memories. And then we have these small panels for quick action. We see this a lot in manga today. So bang, 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 and then, oh no, he's falling off the train platform. Lots of little, and then this blur because of the movement of the train. And the book is concluded. Now look here. When this book was written, it was before the internet, or before the internet was widespread. And so the bibliography mentions that many of the sources for this book came from fanzines. I'm not sure that fanzines are even around today. I would assume the internet takes much of that place in fandom. Now, I've never been to a comic convention, so maybe fanzines in some form still exist, but this is an interesting look at the way research had to be done back then. Anyway, we've finished up this book, but I still have hundreds and hundreds of more comics to discuss in the future. So for now, let's look at the progress in the sketchbook. So we're actually coming to the end of the parade, and here at the end of the parade we have basically an alien circus, because that would be interesting to draw and interesting to see. So we have a lion, an alien lion tamer, with a two-headed lion with wings. I'm assuming he's in a cage. I don't really know. How do aliens work? And then we get dinosaurs, or more precisely, alien dinosaurs. And so when I was penciling this, I was thinking, how far can one take a dinosaur and still have it recognizable as a dinosaur? And the thing about dinosaurs is that while it is true that they are an archaeological issue, they are also a cultural one, like a dragon or a gnome. So, dragons can be pushed in various directions in different cultures. We have, as Tolkien called them, the wire worms of Asia. And even things like dwarves and gnomes can also be pushed. For instance, the Klingons in Star Trek are dwarves, essentially, in terms of their outlook on life and the placement of them in a story, in the same way that Vulcans are elves, perhaps high elves. So, with dinosaurs, one thing that I did is some of them have extra legs, like the creatures of Barsoom. Some of them I just kind of give it random knobs or antennae. And you'll notice that many of them have feathers. Now, this is something that, in some ways, pop culture hasn't quite reached up to the scientific understanding of dinosaurs. And this is a complicated subject. Obviously, there are some dinosaurs in pop culture which are meant to be closer to how we think they looked. But how to explain this? All right. I thought the easiest way to explain this is to look at an example. So, The Lost World by Doyle was, in some ways, it is the book that created the image of the pop culture dinosaur. Obviously, for, I would assume, an Edwardian audience. This is a child's version. I picked this because of the illustration on the cover. And one thing about the book which is interesting is that we see the beginnings of the way dinosaurs would be viewed, in the sense that we have a hierarchy. And in the book, the main dinosaur is the iguanodon. There are pterodactyl dinosaurs in the book. We do see a meat eater who is not a Tyrannosaurus rex. He's a smaller one, maybe an allosaur. But what's how to show this? So when this, okay, so this is called a megalosaurus, which is supposed to be the size of a pony in the book, if I remember right. So when this book was adapted into the silent film, Willis O'Brien created models, but the models that he created for that film became the image of the dinosaur for 1925. So he had the Brontosaurus as sort of your main dinosaur, the Tyrannosaurus Rex as the main threat, and then he had I guess a Triceratops would be sort of like the elephant of this world, and then in the background we could have the Stegosaurus and pterodactyls. And so that film became the image of the dinosaur, and that became those are the generic images of dinosaurs that we saw in comic books after that time period. Those are the same generic dinosaurs we basically see in King Kong. And then, this gets perpetuated later on with Alley Oop and the Flintstones. And Ray Harryhausen did do some dinosaurs for the Valley of Guanji and maybe some other things that don't quite come to mind. So this is the pop culture image of the dinosaur as not only the scaly monster with the dragging tail, but also that there's a certain hierarchy, the T-Rex, the Brontosaur, the Tyrannosaurus, the Triceratops. And so by the time we get to the 1990s and Spielberg is working on Jurassic Park, his scientific advisors were telling him, we think that many of these dinosaurs were feathered, or at least had proto-feathers, pinions. Not completely feathered, but a little bit like the ostrich, where the ostrich has feathers on key parts of its body. But Spielberg didn't think that feathered creatures were scary, or pinioned creatures. Um, and I think this was a pity, because I think they would have been very scary because they would have been so unusual from our experience. Now, of course, it's perfectly fine to do the fantasy dinosaur, and we're going to turn back to my sketchbook and see the fantasy dinosaur. But the thing is, he tried to do both a fantasy dinosaur and a scientific dinosaur, because for those of us who were around when that film came out, Spielberg was toting that his film was completely scientifically accurate, which is absurd. And this is sort of a mantra that those films have taken, even though the films are clearly fantasy. I believe in the third film, they put a few little pinions on the Velociraptor and just sort of pretended that they were going to do a little bit of scientific realism. The point I'm trying to make is that you could either go for the fantasy or with the scientific. And here I'm going with the fantasy because that goes with my art style and the type of storytelling that I'm trying to do. But mixing the two is unfortunate. So here, a thunder lizard menagerie. I had to look up where the accent goes on menagerie. It's a French word. So we, how far could we take the form of the dinosaur? And of course we have aliens, because it's an alien circus. They are guiding the dinosaurs in some fashion. Now for this image, I was thinking of the book Dinotopia. And on the cover, or at least one of the main pages, we do see a brontosaur coming through an arch, a little bit of the Arch of Triumph. So this is a little bit of an homage to that. But I'm not trying to copy that, because you can see Mesoamerican architecture here, and because obviously these are alien dinosaurs. I do not have a copy of Dinotopia. Perhaps it is a book that I should get for my nieces and nephews. The artwork is, of course, incredible. I do remember as a child being a little frustrated with the story, and it may just be because of the way my generation was taught. Of course, when I was very little, in elementary school, we were given children's books to read, obviously children's adaptations of books. But even at an early age, our teachers would read to us aloud from the unabridged versions of classic books. And I know at least by the 4th or 5th grade, I was reading unabridged versions of certain timeless stories, like Treasure Island and Swiss Family Robinson. Definitely some of H.G. Wells stuff. I read The Time Machine in elementary school, and Tom Sawyer and books like that. And so I think I remember when I read Dinotopia thinking the artwork was amazing, but the story could use a little bit of work. And maybe it's because children in my generation were given, I don't want to say adult books, I mean Treasure Island, but we were given unabridged books at a very early age and just taught to read them. And so a book that didn't quite have those literary qualities didn't really the, the story wasn't really what kept us around for Dinotopia. That's what I'm trying to say. Although I could be wrong. These are old memories, and maybe I should find a copy and reread them. Maybe they're a lot better than I remember. I do think that one difficulty with comics, and a picture book is a comic, of course, is that many of the people come from the art world and they haven't studied literature, and they haven't really thought about characterization and story. They've thought a lot about world building, of course. Anyway, so every circus needs clowns, and so alien clowns, so it's just kind of being whimsical here. I have, in a comic we have to have very broad gestures for things, and so what is a broad gesture for a dance? That's not ballet. So I just went on the computer and typed in K-pop and looked at kind of the really broad movements. So this is a K-pop movement as interpreted by aliens. And then, of course, in a parade we always have people giving out candy. So we have alien clowns giving out candy. And I am going to include some EO hippi. Those would be prehistoric horses. And the reason, of course, is because parades often end with Shriners, and Shriners go in little cars, but we don't really have cars in the setting, so I'm going to have little horses and a little train, and that's actually going to be the conclusion of the parade. We'll have a few more pages of the parade, but we are moving towards alien Shriners. I don't know what alien Shriners look like, but that will be something I have to figure out. Anyway, I'm glad that I had a time to talk to you about comics and the depiction of dinosaurs, and I hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.